if I'm talking to myself, like look in a mirror and I'm talking to myself, do I sound inspiring when
Hmm.
I'm doing that? I think mocking and practicing by looking at yourself to see what your body's doing, because if you can inspire you, if you get excited about what you're talking about, you'll see it in the mirror. And that memory then's here in your head so that when you're in front of other people.
I'm your host, Mickey Bennett, and in today's episode, we will be having another conversation with our quality contest chair, Bonnie Dubin, and we will be talking about speechcraft. Stay tuned for this conversation. Welcome to D50 After Dark, and welcome back to the show, Bonnie.
Great, thanks. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah. Now, as we discussed last time, you are a little new to Toastmasters and new to your role as quality contest chair. And so there's still a lot about Toastmasters contests you're learning. However, you have a wealth of knowledge and experience about giving great speeches.
So I'm told.
So you're told.
Yes, I do.
Yes. So today I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about speechcraft and get some tips from you on how our aspiring contestants can make their speeches as impactful as possible.
Okay. Number one, always try to talk about something you know a little bit about, and tag that with, remember, nobody else in the audience knows what it is you're going to say, so you really can't make a mistake. Unless you're doing something that's really about facts and figures, it's all just up to you and bringing it out. I do not recommend that you actually write out word for word on a speech. I find when you do that, then what you try to do is memorize. And then if you trip up somewhere in your conversation because the memorization got lost somewhere, you kind of sputter to try to figure out where you were on the paper, if that makes sense. So those are two huge tips that I would start out with.
Yeah, I agree with both of those points. I've given this advice many times in evaluations. You'll sometimes have somebody, they're giving their speech, things are going well, and then somewhere like 2/3 or so into their speech, they're like, oh, I forgot this and that. Let me go back and talk about that real quick. And so I tell them, we don't know that you gave that out of sequence of what you intended, right? We
Right.
didn't know what your outline was. So if you realize that you skipped a piece, just naturally go to that and don't point out that you made a mistake because we don't know.
Or just skip it all together. Maybe it wasn't important enough to remember, and that's why you forgot it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true.
Yep. I also, alluding to something you mentioned in our previous conversation, if you're doing a speech again, so you're picking up and trying in this contest to do something you prior talked about, again, don't try to word for word what it is you said before. Just let it flow in natural conversation to wherever your head is taking us at that moment. So when I'm doing leadership training here at Willis Knighton, what I try to do is come up with a basic scenario of what I want the learning component to be. And I have to do the same talk 7 times because we have 7 locations in our hospital system. And each time I can guarantee you it's not the exact talk, but it does have the exact points somewhere in it. So don't worry so much about being exact and repeating something that you said, or if you miss something, just have, I would suggest no more than 3, but some places where you read and learn about speeches, they'll say 4, just main points, and then let it flow from there, from those points.
Yeah, I agree completely. I'm sure some people will disagree about writing your whole speech out or not writing it out. And I think both approaches can be useful. Writing out your speech word for word can be useful in coming up with some like rhetorical devices to use. But when it comes to it, when I give a speech, I work from three to 5 bullet points, and I treat them each like its own little table topic.
Yeah,
right? A
perfect.
table topic that I've already done several times, so it's not catching me off guard. But there, I'm working from an outline, like you said.
You also need to practice. Practice makes perfect. That's the bottom line. And practice with the timer on,
Yeah,
because it really can be a little bit disconcerting when they start flashing green cards, yellow cards, red cards, and then you're like, oh my God, where am I at? I'll have to hurry up. You see what I'm saying? So practice your speech, even if it's not with somebody else. Everyone's phone probably has some kind of timer on it. Set your timer. And if it goes off, if it's a 5-minute speech, even though you have 7 minutes, try to stick, just as that 5 minute goes off, try to stick with closing somewhere in that line. That way, if you go a little bit longer, you have that leeway, but you don't have those cards flashing in front of you. I find those very disconcerting when I'm talking. I'm like,
yeah, yeah. On that note, when you're talking about practicing with a timer, which I think is very important, especially if you're going to compete. One piece of advice I often give people is when you're practicing, don't ever stop halfway through.
true. Yes, totally agree.
If you're going to practice your whole speech, now there's something to be said for practicing just a part of your speech intentionally, but when you're practicing your whole speech, don't stop, because then you're training yourself to have like an ejection seat in the middle of the contest, which you
Mm,
can't do. You can't
right.
stop in the contest, so you have to practice not stopping beforehand.
If you really want to have some fun, record yourself and listen back, because, as I'm sure you know, Mickey, we really don't sound when we hear our voice as we do when we hear it inside our head.
Yes, this is
But
true.
practicing and hearing what you're saying will help you with the ums and the ahs and all those things the grammarian's always looking for, to see if you're inserting things that shouldn't be inserted, that have nothing to do with the actual talk.
I think if you're serious about winning contests, you're going to have to do a video of yourself and watch it several times, probably.
Yeah. Or have a friend, if you have a good friend that'll watch and listen to you and uh, give you some feedback on there, on here's what I saw, here's what I didn't see. You seem to triple over that, or that didn't make sense when you said it didn't tie in. Always getting extra feedback, I think, is great. I like feedback. Not everybody likes to hear that, but I do.
Yeah. Well, that's what it's all about in Toastmasters, is getting that feedback.
Agreed.
Now, you mentioned that you should speak about something that you know about.
Hmm.
And on a similar note, would you say that you should also be passionate about what you're speaking about?
It certainly is helpful to be passionate. Uh, what I've found most interesting thus far, I think, in Toastmasters is the table talks, where some person has just dreamed up some subject matter that more than likely you're not passionate about. But I find it fun that every now and again, it's literally something that you're like, oh my gosh, I really do like that subject matter. And it's just flows so much easier if it's something that's dear to your heart or passionate in your conversations with other people. It certainly does help you stay on track easier and flow more in the conversation. You asked me to talk about teams and how they work and function. I, right off the top of my head, I can go on and on for 5 minutes and be done.
Yeah, because you're passionate about teams.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. I mentioned previously when we were talking about table topics that I had given a table topics, not table topics, tall tales. The
Right.
alliteration of T got me confused there. Tall tales. I'd competed in a tall tales contest and gave a speech about the Illuminati chasing me under
Hmm.
tunnels under Dallas, which there actually are tunnels under Dallas. That's a whole other story. Uh, I'm not necessarily passionate about the Illuminati. It's just like a silly thing for my tall tale. But I do like a good conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
My dad liked conspiracy theories, so that made it like more enjoyable and fun, and that enthusiasm came across in my tall tale.
That's awesome. Yeah. It's learning to enter it off the cuff. I think even in a tall tale, in that particular contest, if you choose to do that, it's important to kind of think through what do you want to say and how do you want it to come across the tale itself. And I think one of the things that judges in that particular kind would be looking for is, what was your theme behind it, not just hosh posh here, there, and everywhere of thought process as you're going through your tall tale, to have kind of still a beginning and an end, but have fun in the middle of it with your exaggeration. And I would think most exaggeration is also humorous, which also makes it more pleasant to hear the conversation that you're having with them.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I think any speech having vocal variety and body language and gestures is important. That's why we focus on those things in Toastmasters. But the tall tale, I think, especially benefits from over the top vocal variety and body language. And so,
Agreed.
do
I
you
can
have
see it.
any?
I haven't heard one, but I can agree with that comment.
Yeah, so do you have any tips in the realm of gestures, body language, vocal variety for our listeners who want to compete?
Well, having never seen a competition, I can just tell you my thought process is that what I've learned as being a professional speaker, try not to flail your arms too much, but at the same time, some people like to stand like this with their hands, like a newscaster does. I don't think that's very good when you're trying to give a talk, particularly in a conversational way in a contest. So you want to have some movement, but you don't want to have exaggerated movements in a normal kind of talk. Now, it might be different with your tall tale because that it might be needed to be big and much more boisterous in that particular type of speech that you're giving. I think that you need to remember that people can see and feel what you're interacting out from your body and your tone. If you didn't know, they both work in tandem from your unconscious mind. So let's just say somewhere in your speech, you're having to say something that you might have a slight disagreement on for whatever that subject matter is. Your face might do something like this, then your tone changes, which then changes the way it's interpreted to the person watching you and hearing you.
Hmm.
It's a thing. Your brain's amazing.
It is. It
It
is.
is.
It reminds me of a TED talk I saw about power poses and how this woman was advising you do certain, like the Wonder Woman power pose where you put your fists on your hips and
Nah.
straddle your legs to like a power pose, and it would like give you more confidence if you spent like 5 minutes before an interview in a power pose.
Ah,
It was, it was a
interesting. I had never heard that. Interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, it is pretty interesting, but I think that kind of touches on what you're saying, that all these things work together, your body language and your vocal variety and the way you come across to your audience, they're all integrated very, very intimately.
Yes. So what we hear is 7% of anything when you're communicating is actually the words. People are much more looking at your body language, the tone you're coming along with it. So again, we're back to that practice part. Practice your speech, time your speech as you're practicing it, because when you get flustered, your face changes, your body changes, your tone changes, and thus now the judge, if you're in a contest, sees that fluster, and then that changes your scoring. If you want to just go to the contest mode on there, when you're standing on a stage, everything you do is seen and interpreted, not just the words you're saying.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, something you said just reminded me is when the judges judge you in a contest, or they evaluate your speech in a sense, they have a score sheet. So it's not just like, oh, I like this person better. They literally have a score sheet, and there are several categories, each having a certain portion of the points for the speech, and they give a score within each of those categories and then add up the total points, and then whichever contestant had the most points is the one that gets that judge's first place designation. So it can be very useful for people who are competing in the contest to look at the judge's score sheet, which is available online. You can find it, and because it tells you what the judges are looking at for your speech.
Yes, and that's great advice. Go on to the Toastmasters site and look up contests and look at the rules and regulations and what they're looking for, and kind of hone your speech around what you've read and interpreted there. I think that's great advice.
One more question for you about speechcraft. So we have the International Speech Contest, and I think of that as being more than anything a speech to inspire people.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily. There's other ways to really impact your audience other than inspiration, but that's usually what I think of. So do you have any advice for making your speech more inspirational to your audience?
I think that the first thing you need to think about is, if I'm talking to myself, like look in a mirror and I'm talking to myself, do I sound inspiring when I'm doing that? I think mocking and practicing by looking at yourself to see what your body's doing, because if you can inspire you, if you get excited about what you're talking about, you'll see it in the mirror, and that memory then's here in your head, so that when you're in front of other people, you can sort of mimic. Your brain remembers that. And so that then becomes inspiring to the people in front. Think about word usage. What are inspiring words to your topic that would be interesting for the crowd and get them to maybe sit up straighter and, oh, I like that word. Listen a little bit harder. So look at what you're using in the speech itself. And most importantly, we go back to what you and I already talked about. Is the subject you're talking about passionate to you? Because if it is, it's much easier to inspire somebody else to try to feel that passion from the stage.
That's such perfect advice. It's very good advice, and it reminds me of something I learned in another organization I was in, at Landmark, where a coach told me, how do you know you're being inspiring when you yourself are inspired? Just like what you said now. And I think that's true in a lot of instances. I have given a speech in International Speech Contest a few times about my father and him passing away. And there's a point where, trying to convey to the audience the sadness and tragedy of that loss. And in order to really make sure that that's getting across, I have to myself kind of get back in touch with those kind of old feelings of loss and sadness, and just really kind of open myself up internally to those emotions. Because if I'm not doing that, it's probably going to come across as stale to the audience.
Right. Agreed.
Wow. So it's been so much fun talking to you about speechcraft. Do you have a call to action for our listeners?
Yes. If you're going to do the contest, which we hope many of you will decide to do, practice, practice, practice.
Practice, practice, practice. Yeah, many of us have time off for the holidays, or actually by the time people will hear this episode, it's going to be after Christmas.
But we still have New Year's holiday. At least we do.
Yeah. So, but yeah, call to action, write your speech, practice your speech, and get ready for contest.
Yep.
Awesome.
Everybody give it a try.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. We're going to have one last conversation. We're going to talk about leadership in our next episode. So listeners, catch us next week when Bonnie returns one last time to talk about leadership and working with teams. You heard her today. She's very passionate about this subject. So you'll want to join us. And thank you for joining us today.